Okay, the recording has started. And thank you for joining today's online meetup, Ansible for Networking, where today we're going to talk about network configuration management. And we'll really focus in on network compliance and router upgrades and backups and many other features that we can use in the Ansible automation platform with Ansible playbooks to provide you a way of automating those types of processes. So one of the things that I wanted to do is just before we go into the demo where I'll show you the Ansible automation platform, and we'll go through content of the demo and watch it work, and I'll happy to answer any questions on how things were able to work under the hood. I thought it was a good idea just to kind of take just a little bit of a level set and talk about network configuration management. So we'll do that briefly. And then I'll give you, just a quick view of what the demo environment looks like, and we'll talk about some of the use cases again, what you'll see in the demo. And then we'll walk through the demo, which does have a lot of moving parts. So again, we'll focus kind of on the salient points, and then I'm happy to drill in a little bit deeper where needed if there's some clarification or any other questions that surface as we go through. Let me grab that real quick. So this will slow down here in a sec. Hopefully, just letting people in. Unfortunately, with this platform, I have to allow people in, or they'll be sitting in like a lobby type of thing. So let's get this out of here, and I'll keep it on this screen so I can see the people come in. Yeah, so sorry about that. So let me go back here, and we'll go ahead and get started. Here at the bottom, just in case you're joining this meetup for the first time, we do have a Discord chat that you can use. Probably not so much for today because we do have a chat, capability and Q&A built into the Google Meets. But afterwards, as you're going through some of this content later, then feel free to join the Discord chat because you can ask questions pertaining to the meetup topic. And as always, what we do is for the first 50, maybe 55 minutes or so, we go through the primary topic. And then optionally, what I do is I'll cut off the recording. And for those that want to stay on, I have hands-on labs that are a part of a study group. So if you're joining for the first time, I'll talk a little bit more about the study group on the second half. And there's a lab guide, and I'll get you started in terms of being able to start back from like the beginning of the lab guide and kind of catch up to us later. And I'll go through today's topic, and you can follow along if you're not comfortable setting up the environment that you need for the lab. Again, if you're new to it, if you've been into these study groups before, then you'll know how to to set up your environment and those types of things. So I think someone was trying to get in, so let's go ahead and grab them. Cool. I think we're all caught up in that regard. All right. So having said all that, let's go ahead and dig into the network configuration management. And if you do want to join in, feel free to ask a question again in the chat. Although, like when I'm sharing the PowerPoint slides, I really don't see the chat, but I think I hear it. So I'll pay attention there, and I'll toggle over as needed. But also, if you see that I've neglected your question, feel free to just unmute yourself, and you can ask it live. I'm happy to stop, and we have plenty of time to cover questions and things like that. Another thing you can do too is if I ask you a question, as a group, then back here you do have some emojis. So maybe I'll ask you, for thumbs up, just to poll you on something. So just be aware that you have these emojis towards the bottom of your screen. And you can also raise your hand too, but I'm not sure if that makes a noise, so I may or may not notice that. But if you do see that happen, feel free to also unmute yourself and just let me know that you put a question in the chat or whatever, and I'm happy to take a look at that. So back to network configuration management. So this again is really just kind of like my viewpoint of network configuration management. Yours may differ, but for the most part, these are the types of use cases that I see when working with customers in the field that fall under this category. So one of the big ones that's normally included in any of the network configuration management solutions is configuration backups and restore. And what I'm talking about, like from a networking perspective, are the devices, like routers, switches, firewalls, load balancers, pretty much all of the physical or virtual devices that are in a particular architecture. Now, how they're deployed may be different depending on which network domain we're talking about. So that could be in the data center, that could be in the campus or in the WAN, or some type of more of an edge use case, or in the cloud now is more prevalent. So those devices would tend to be architected a bit differently. And again, maybe more virtual than physical, depending on which one of those domains we're talking about. But primarily everything, right? And outside of networking too, primarily everything needs to be backed up, and there should be a mechanism, in case of a full failure, to be able to restore those configurations. We'll also talk a bit about, maybe not so much this session, but in other sessions, I talk a little bit more about like more of the scoped rollbacks. So those are more like configuration, like specific configuration rollbacks, as opposed to rolling back the entire configuration. For these purposes, like at a high level view of this, it's more like restoring the entire configuration based off of your backups. The second topic, which is similar and related, is the firmware and software image upgrades of the devices. So sometimes you're just upgrading the software images. Sometimes, at some point you have to upgrade the firmware too. And there's, normally a manual process that's in place. And we'll talk about some of the alternatives that you may be using, but you can certainly use Ansible to be able to automate any of those manual processes. And by using config modules, you can also respond to prompts. So a lot of times when we're in that particular use case, there are situations where we're prompted for information, and then through automation we can respond to those prompts, and then that's how we can effectively emulate that whole process of upgrading and interacting with like boot flash and that type of stuff. So we'll show that in the demo. So that's a part of the demo. Backups are a part of the demo. Software upgrades are a part of the demo. Configuration compliance checks. So those could mean something different depending on what type of industry you work in. But even if you're not regulated to some extent, which most companies are regulated by something, right? So I work more with public sector in Red Hat. So we have a lot of you know in terms of compliance, there's a lot of security compliance. STIG is something that I do have in my demo, but I'll probably disable it for this particular run through, so it takes less time. And if you're not familiar with STIG, I'm just bringing that up as an example. That stands for security, technical implementation process. So it's like based off of NIST guidance on how you should configure a particular device. And then DIS is an organization that that creates how do you apply STIG against these types of devices. So in the network space, we have, again, the router, switches, load balancers, etc. Right, and those you can certainly apply STIG checks or other types of checks, based off of the type of regulation that you have, or you probably have your own configuration guidelines based off of your baseline internal, and have particular configuration checks that you would periodically run to ensure that your devices are within compliance. Now, what if they're not in compliance? Then sometimes that could warrant like an auto remediation, uh, but most likely it's not automated, or immediately remediated. So normally, those would also indicate a need for downtime, and then said remediations would be pushed at a later date. So in this particular demo, I'm going to show you like how does Ansible address that particular need. Like, how do you identify when there is a compliance failure, and then how can you like notify the teams, and then set up that particular downtime approval, based off of change control and all that kind of stuff, and then through a workflow push those configuration changes later and then test them, right? So we'll see that in the demo as well. Another aspect of configuration management that is more of an emerging type of need, because now that we're introducing automated workflows when making configuration changes, if automation is the baseline for a particular configuration, and it's supposed to be, automated first type of thing, then, your single source of truth is then, wrapped around that particular automated, task or workflow. And what happens if someone goes outside of that? So if the policy is to automate, and then you have, your particular, configuration backups and checks, and what we call it is an intended configuration. So once you have that single source of truth, that configuration that's a known good, then it has, some type of, label, tag, stamp that says that, this is the intended configuration. And a lot of times, what we would do is we would store that as an artifact in like a Git repository, as an example, or somewhere that is your single source of truth. That could be like an IPAM system, like InfoBox or NetBox, something like that, or it could be, spreadsheets or whatever the case may be. You have that configuration documented and then checked against to make sure that it's not drifting or changing. And usually where the drift or the change come from is it's a result of someone going in out of band to make changes directly on the devices. And that could be okay because it may be, a result of a troubleshooting, right? So a ticket's opened and, someone makes a change. But if that change is needed to be made, on future configuration changes or become like the new baseline, then that needs to be, ingested into the single source of truth for the automation. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a configuration backup after we have a known good configuration, and then we can check against that too. So a lot of times, like, it's kind of confusing because we're doing compliance checks, and usually those are configurations that need to be on every device of a certain type. Configuration drift could include those types of configurations, but it could also be like other configurations that are more around not so much compliance aspects, but just like a particular configuration that's used within your architecture. So a part of the underlay or overlay, from a networking perspective. And if someone changes something there, then we would want to know about that as well. So the change might not be like a compliance violation, but it's like a violation because, again, it's not your configuration baseline. And we would want to know that. And then lastly, the change management. So once we know we have, these deltas between what the configuration should be and the current state is actually something else, then it's either like a remediation or it could be like a net new configuration that we want to push into that environment. So how do we manage those types of configuration changes and make those changes a part of CMDB and the like, right? So that could involve like additional integrations and stuff like that. So those are effectively the categories, and each one of them kind of has its own use case, and it falls under this larger umbrella of network configuration management. So I'm going to pop over here because actually, yeah, I did hear someone coming in. So let me let this person in. And then what we're going to do here is I just want to give you like a real quick walkthrough of what's out there today, or what I see, primarily like working with my customers. They may have one or like all of these particular options implemented as part of their network configuration management. And, just to provide some contrast between these three options and kind of double click into what you might see in these categories, I'll just walk through this quickly. So obviously, in the network space, you may have a vendor of choice, and it may be a single vendor, for your switches and routers, and maybe even firewalls. Maybe they're all the same vendor. Um, However, when you start talking about like load balancers and other things, then normally you're talking about, more than one vendor in that case. So let me admit you. Come on in. Right. So you may have a vendor, you may have more than one vendor. And what you'll notice is that most vendors, have proprietary systems that give you the ability to manage or to provide the network configuration management that's a part of like an add-on system. So these are just some examples. I'm not saying like one's better than the other or anything like that. These are just some examples out in the field. So like Cisco has DNA Center, and Cisco DNA Center focuses more on like the campus domain, right? So from a Wi-Fi perspective and a wired campus, from like either an SDA fabric or some sort of legacy standalone Catalyst type of infrastructure. It's managing those devices And those devices that become, a part of that database and DNA center is your single source of truth. And then from a configuration management perspective, it's providing you with config backups. They call it swim for like the upgrades of the firmware and the like. And all of that is like a part of that system, but it's very focused. And we'll talk about that more in a second. So let me let y'all in here. Welcome aboard. So So in terms of like the scope, right? So DNA Center really doesn't cover all of Cisco products because if you look in like the data center, there's the Nexus dashboard. And in terms of network configuration management, they usually do more than that. They also provide you with telemetry, like in terms of like the dashboards and observability. So they're usually doing more, and it's very the viewpoint is very focused on a particular solution. Arista has the Cloud Vision portal, and that's like kind of like the Nexus dashboard. That's focused more on the data center networking, but it has network configuration management. Aruba has the management engine. Actually, typo there, but management engine, and they all kind of do similar things, but in their scope or in their domain. Um, they do a really good job for particular thing, but there is a trade, right? Because if you had like multiple solutions, like even within a vendor and a multi-vendor, I see a lot of customers managing multiple solutions, right? So the pros that I see are there's always that deeper API integration and a quicker turnaround to support like new features. So as the vendor releases new software, then certainly their API supports their GUI, but also they may have or usually have like some type of SDK so that you can use REST API calls and make them to the northbound API as an alternative, right? So instead of using their GUI, you can use that. So they're usually pretty quick to provide those types of updates, right? They have domain expertise because it's their product, right? So no one really understands the back end, right? The intent of what you're configuring better than the vendor. And in some cases, they offer a complete, no code solution to give you, some automation in terms of network configuration management. The cons are, again, it's like it's either bound to like a particular product or vendor. Um, so when there's integration points, then that could become an issue there uh, in terms of like other third parties, and they're usually not customizable in the sense that in a coding type of solution you can go in and pretty much build anything that you need, um, or even like a temporary workaround like while you're waiting on vendors to update features and things like that. And then obviously this is a vendor lock-in to some extent because it is a single source of truth for a particular solution, and that's very sticky. It's a little bit hard to unravel from if you decide to make changes. So a lot of times it's more of like a longer migration off of some of these things as if you decide to bring in alternative or multi-vendor solutions. So that's where we kind of move to the second category, which is the low code and GUI solutions that actually are multi-vendor in nature. So some of the ones that are out there, and like SolarWinds has been out there for a long time, and they have like a network manager that does network configuration management. NetMRI is similar to SolarWinds, and again, like multi-vendor. Apstra is multi-vendor, but it was acquired by Juniper, so you kind of get a little bit of the proprietary piece probably coming into that. But all of them are similar in the sense that they provide you with a GUI and maybe some level of scripting to make changes, but it's not like extensible, or it's certainly not like an automation platform where you can build anything that you want. So the use cases that they support, they do a really good job. So it like within network configuration management. But what about use cases outside of that? Because this is normally like a starting point, and then as teams develop a solution or an automated solution around network configuration management, then they start to look at, okay, automated deployments, and then moving into like these very specific solutions and architectures, using automation to build things or to make like adds and moves and changes like day two or day one types of changes, and day two like operational stuff where you're starting to get feedback loops back from said architecture. So with the low code, they're always I mean they're all different, right? I don't want to like paint them all as the same, but typically they're pretty easy to get started with. And there's usually either no code or a very low code requirement to configure them. And then, they're multi-vendor. So again, if you're changing solutions or have multiple solutions and vendors in your environment, then that's definitely not an issue. But today, or at least what I see with most of them, although they can be deployed either on-prem or in the cloud in most cases, and some of them may even have like a software as a service, uh, way of consuming them. They typically to be network only, so it's not like configuration management like across all your IT domains, but within the network, that's their focal point. But sometimes they do have legacy. The way that they work under the hood is more legacy in nature, like requirements or dependencies on SNMP for it to actually work or to make configuration changes, as opposed to using newer, more modern infrastructure as code methodologies as an example. And there's feature dependencies because it takes them some time to build new features and for them to respond to the vendors as they release, new features into their solutions. Then obviously there's a lot more turnaround time, right? Because now they're dealing with multiple vendors, so it takes them a while to add new features into their platform. And then, although they do have some scripting, it's not like super customizable to do like any type of use case in automation. And that's really where like Ansible kind of fills the bill there. Because if you look at just Ansible, like not Ansible automation platform that I'll talk about in a second, but just Ansible in general, you can automate anything, right? So within the network space, but really across all the domains. So once you build like those foundational skill sets, with your playbooks and also, around YAML, then really the sky is the limit there. And just jumping back here because I forgot to turn on my camera, so I'm a real person. So with saying that, so what's the difference like with just using Ansible, like open source Ansible, and then like the Ansible automation platform? So really the biggest difference and where a lot of the benefits come from in network configuration management in particular is the AAP, the Ansible automation platform. And today you're going to see the controller, but there's also like additional components that are part of the automation platform. It really gives you the tools that you need to provide orchestration. So with orchestration, you can attack several different use cases at the same time. And it's fairly simple to provide the same capabilities that we've talked about to the left here. Although some people have like a misconception that it's really difficult to do a lot of these things in Ansible. So if I can do it over here with these tools, why would I, potentially use Ansible as an alternative way? So again, like to kind of walk through that, and you're going to see the workflow in great detail. So I won't spend too much time there, but you'll see like how much you can get done in a short period of time. But one of the things again is like the multi-vendor part of it, but not just multi-vendor in that the software will support like use cases for multi-vendors. There's multi-vendors that are contributing to the Ansible ecosystem. So they do that from a community perspective with Galaxy, but then they also contribute to our certified collections. So those are the supported collections from Ansible or from Red Hat that you can open up tickets, and we provide triage and work with the vendors to ensure that their modules work. So modules are really like the code behind the scenes. And in the network space, typically those are written in Python. So they do like kind of the heavy lifting for you. And then you're leveraging YAML to define parameters, right? So it is like the definition file is more human readable. And then on the back end, it's been abstracted for you, right? So you don't have to deal with REST APIs directly or command lines, although they do exist. But it's more behind the scenes when you run your playbooks. But the other part of this is validated content. So even though there is a bit of a skill set, and that's kind of like one of the cons I put here, is that you do need to understand YAML and playbooks and some of those foundational skills. With validated content, what we do is we put a wrapper around use cases and make it very easy through a role to manage a bunch of vetted playbooks that are a part of roles. So it's kind of like a role that manages roles that does a particular use case. So it is actually turning Ansible from being kind of like a not a low code, kind of a heavy code, more into a low code model without losing the extensibility. So it's very extensible because, again, you'll see these use cases, but you can support really any use case that you can think of could be supported in the automation platform. Once you have those skill sets, then the sky's the limit, and very rapidly you'll have wins. And through the validated content, it makes it very easy to get started, and then to move much further than what you may have been able to do in the past using the older techniques of automating in Ansible. So we'll see. We'll talk a bit more about the validated content. I've showed it on some past sessions we've had, but I will circle back to more validated content. Today, it's mainly around the resource modules is what I'm using, but the idea is like validated content would stitch a lot of those together. And there are some new validated content that'll supersede some of what you'll see today that'll be released soon, like in terms of backups and things like that, that make it even easier than what you're going to see. So it only gets better. So from the con side of things, you do have some need for a little bit of a skill set to get started around YAML. And then it's hard to stay focused sometimes. So I kind of put that as a con because there's so much you can automate. You really have to be disciplined and have a focus on the types of use cases that are kind of low risk to get started. So we call them the opportunistic types of use cases. And then as you move further along and build those skill sets and start to have confidence in your environment with moving some of this like into your production systems, then you'll start adding more and more. We definitely discourage like kind of like going in with this end-to-end automation type of thing where you're kind of dabbling in every possible use case that you have. You really want to be disciplined and focused. And that's a topic for another discussion, more around how do you get started with automation and some of the planning and design around using Ansible and content and that type of thing. But I just wanted to put that out there. There's so much you can do that sometimes you could be your worst enemy and a bit dangerous if you try to do too much, up front. So in terms of the demo, this is the topology. It's just 4 routers, and I just wanted you to be familiar with it. It is multi-vendor. Router 1 is Cisco. It's a CSR 1000B router running in AWS. Router 2 and router 4 are Arista. So they have the EOS operating system. They're virtualized as well, and this whole thing is in AWS. And then router 3 is Juniper, so it has Junos. So the way that they're configured is there's OSPF from these two would be more like the edge routers hanging off of this cord that's running BGP. The routing protocols really don't matter so much in this scenario, but we will do some checks to make sure that we have neighbor relationships after we make changes as a post check to to validate that everything's working. So from that, what I want to do, I'll pause for a second. If anyone has any questions, actually, let me pop over here and make sure I'm not missing anybody. So is there a difference between Ansible AAP and Ansible Tower? So I think I covered like Ansible and AAP. The Tower really has just been an evolution of the product. So if you look at Ansible, or what we call Ansible Core Engine, the command line, then everything there is ran locally from where you install Ansible. The Tower was kind of like taking that whole approach, and normally the best practice for that particular implementation is on virtual environments because it's a Python application, and the Tower was also ran on virtual environments. So the thing is that you could have like the same Python modules and things. All that would work the same because you're using the same Ansible core engine like under the Tower. So the Tower was really just a GUI tool to manage your automation. But the architecture is different than what we have today. The platform is more containerized in nature. We have this execution environment that runs as a container. And the cool thing about it is in the execution environment is where all of your content is. So that's where your modules live inside of collections. And the execution environment is a container that runs from Podman. And you use the same container or execution environments in the controller. So the controller, you can kind of see that is the like evolution of Tower to controller. And then there's other components that we'll talk about on other sessions that do other things. But the controller took on what Tower did. So most of what the Tower did was manage your automation. So manage jobs, job templates for your playbooks, workflows, roles-based access, logging, like all those things that that you would use that go beyond what the regular Ansible, open source Ansible would provide you. Now with the AAP, it does all those same things, but it's just that we can scale differently. The architecture is different. So instead of a scale up HA like we used to have, it's based off of these execution nodes. So this whole notion of an automation mesh. There's like a lot of cool technology that's been included or added into the platform that allows us to continue to scale out in like traditional environments, like bare metal and virtual machines, like installing it there. But also we're available now on top of OpenShift, from like a Kubernetes perspective, and we're available in the cloud. So AWS and Google and Azure, right? So you can deploy this platform in different environments, but it would work the exact same way in terms of the automation. And it still provides you all the tools that you need to go into production at scale, regardless where production lives, whether it's on site, cloud, hybrid, whatever. So that's the difference between them. It's been an evolution, and it's also a product, right? So the product has changed as well. And hopefully I answered that okay for you. So let's jump back. And actually, let's go into the demo. So without further ado, let me go ahead and bring up the automation platform and log in. Oops, it's compliance 2. So what you'll notice is this user is not the admin. And I did that on purpose because I've implemented roles-based access, not so much like to limit myself, from, various components that are part of the automation, but that's how the roles-based access works. Some folks, might be on teams that are a part of particular roles, or users can be bound to particular roles that only give them a certain level of access to different constructs. The way I use it for a demo, oh, actually, I think someone's coming in. Let me admit. The way that I use it is to limit what you see, because I have a lot of different demos in my personal lab system that we're looking at, and it's too busy to look at. So for a demo, I'll limit it from roles-based access to show you just the job templates and workflow templates that are relevant to the use case, right? So what you see here is a bunch of job templates and a bunch of workflow templates. A job template maps to a playbook. So there's a one-to-one relationship between a playbook and a job template. A workflow job template stitches together multiple job templates. So that's the orchestration. Or a workflow job template could stitch together multiple workflows. So we'll talk about the workflow here in a second. I'll just give you a real quick walkthrough of some of the requirements that you need for automation to work. One of those is a project. So we're looking at this project, compliance upgrade and ACL for access list. So if I click into here, you can see that this points to a GitLab repository, right? So I'll provide this link afterwards. This is where all the playbooks and other content lives for this demo. So this is where the controller goes to pull down all of the files. And the benefit of using source control is if I make a change to source control or somebody on my team, we're always pulling down the committed latest version of those particular files. So nobody's working from a local environment where they've made changes and nobody else has them. It's a best practice, like a DevOps best practice, and we use it so that way as we move more towards it, like NetOps or GitOps or whatever you want to call it, when you start to deploy automation more end-to-end automated, but based off of those best practices, you really have to have a repository or a Git type of repository. And there's many flavors of Git. If you're not familiar with that, we'll cover that in other sessions. But that's the idea here, is to use the Git repository. The other thing is an inventory. So you have to have targets of your automation. So in this inventory, I have several different groups. And the ones that we're using today is Cisco only here. Yeah, it is the Cisco only. Yeah, that's right. I'm not doing, actually, I think I said I'm doing the multi-demo one. I'm doing the Cisco environment for this one. So these are 4 Cisco routers. So router 1 through 4 are actually Cisco. But I do have a multi-vendor environment. So in this particular one, I have, different Cisco solutions that have different OSs, right? So you can see that it's important to have the proper operating system. So iOS would be used for the CSR routers and like the Catalyst 8000s. So that's what you see here from like a variable perspective. But the idea here is these are the hosts and the groups. So this is like all the hosts that I have in different sandboxes here. But what's important is like in the group, if I go back to groups and the inventory. So we're in the Cisco only group here. I'm glad I walked through that because I actually forgot that I did that for this one. And then host. These are those 4 routers that I was talking about. So those are the ones that we're actually going to change and upgrade and so on. I think that's why I'm doing the Cisco one, is because of the upgrades. I was able to do that with the Cisco virtual routers allow me to do that. All right, so those are the devices. So let's go back to our templates. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to start this one, and I'm going to talk through all the stuff that's in here, right? So each one of these is a job template or some other construct that I can use in a workflow, like an approval. So this is an approval here, and I have another approval over here. So obviously, it does what what the name is. It requires an approval to move forward, in the particular workflow. So I'll go ahead and start this one, and it's going to ask us for some information. Then I'll walk through what we're actually doing. So the first thing is what routers. So I want these Cisco ones because of the upgrade. And then please select the desired compliance roles. So I can either go through each one of these categories that would provide a very specific compliance around a type of configuration. So NTP configuration, SNMP, logging, access lists. I mentioned STIG earlier, but I'm going to turn that one off so it takes less time. And then show ver is just to see like what version of image is running in the device. And this is going to fail because I did downgrade the iOS on purpose. So that way it'll require an upgrade. So when I hit next here, you can see that everything in that survey, so this is a self-service survey. This self-service survey is a part of the automation controller, but it's not required. You could use ServiceNow or some other front end, and then through an integration, right? Because we have all these, modules and collections. Some of them provide REST API integrations so that you can use other options to provide input. So this is just an option to use the included survey. So that's what I'm doing. But just note that you could use something fancier than this, or if you have your own custom, front end of some sort for self-service, then you could certainly use that as well. But the idea is to take input and then convert it into variables. So these are extra variables that I'm going to push into this workflow. So I've defined the group from the inventory, and then these tags are very similar to using like tags in a playbook, but I'm using roles. So I'm actually going to iterate through various roles, and I'll show you some of that in the code. So I created a variable called tag, and we've decided to run these. So we did not run the STIG, and you do not see that in this list. So this is in YAML. This is a list. So we're going to pass a list of those tags, and then that will iterate through which roles we want to run. And that'll make more sense, hopefully, here as we look at it. So we have that particular information assigned. So I actually forgot to populate something, right? So let me go back. I forgot these, right? So this is the routers. My mouse. Routers. Get rid of STIG. Click here. Now, what version do we want to run? This is the newer version. And I also have to do a checksum just to make sure that nothing gets corrupted. So the first one goes with the first image. So this is the one that's not in there, so it's going to complain about that. And then I launch it. That's a notification with my job number. This is sending a notification to Slack, which is a chat tool, but it could be Microsoft chat or really anything that you're running that has an API. You can potentially set up a notification for that. And you'll notice that this actually failed, right? So let me talk about that. Why did it fail? So this first check here for compliance, I've set this up in what we call check mode. So it won't make any configuration changes, but it will identify what my compliance state is. So it'll look through compliance checks, and they're either going to pass or fail. And in this case, it failed because of the version that was running the image. So let me show you in here. So what you can see is that this is in, where's the mode at? Job template inventory. Let me show it to you from So in the first one in the workflow is the check one, right? So where's that? Oh, here it is. It's up here. I'm sorry, I missed it. So I just want to show you in here where that was set up. So I just want you to be aware of this. It's in check mode. So what happens in check mode is it'll run the playbook, but it won't apply the change to the device. So it's good for like listing out a state of something. But the other one that will run later will be in run mode. And that's where it would actually make changes. So I just wanted to call that out. So let me go back to jobs. And you can see that this compliance workflow is still running because it's at an approval stage. So if I go into here, we can see this one failed. So I'll click into here, into output. Job failed, no output. That's not good. So the upgrade is the second stage. I might have to run that first part again. Failed output. Oh, that's weird that it didn't give me the output. So let's go here. So I'm at an approval stage. So I guess this is a good example, right? So something didn't work here. So we went to this point. So what's happening here is I do a compliance check and it either passes or fails. And I don't know why I didn't get my output, so we'll run that again and see what happened there. And then if it failed, one of the conditions was a failed condition. So if it passed, you have this straight line to downtime to run change. So this is an approval. So if everything was in compliance, we would wind up here. Or I'm sorry, if everything was in terms of the image, if the image was okay, but there was something else out of compliance, then here, if it was all in compliance, we could just stop the job, right? Because it completed, everything was in compliance. But if there's anything out of compliance other than like needing to upgrade, then we could schedule downtime because we need to run the compliance again in run mode. So we actually make the change. And then we want to validate that the change is successful and doesn't impact anything in our environment. And then lastly, we want to back up the configuration to use it as an intended configuration to check against for configuration drift. So in this one, it failed. So it goes to this failure path, which is to stage an image. So all that means is if the image is not already there in boot flash, then push that image, or actually it's in my case, it's using TFTP and it'll pull in the image, but it's not going to do anything with the image. It's just going to sit there in boot flash and it's waiting for an approval for downtime to actually make the upgrade. So we kind of stopped here. So the image is there and we're just kind of sitting here. So what I'm going to do is in this approval stage here, upgrade downtime, I bring that up and instead of approving it, I want to see why that one didn't give me any output. So I'm going to cancel the workflow because I'm not confident to move forward. I want to see what happened there. So that workflow was canceled. And then I get a notification that the job was canceled. So I go back into my templates. And then I'm going to bring up another one. Cisco only. Get rid of Stig. Don't forget to tell it what image. Get the checksum in there. Next, start. All right, so it starts that job. This time, let's watch the output and see what happens. All right, so this time it's doing something. So that was something like my lab or something. That was weird. I'll have to check that in the logs. But now it's going through and it's making some checks. So what you can see from this, what you can glean is it's looking at this case NTP. So there's no current NTP configuration in that device. See how it's an empty dictionary here? So what it's telling us is I've turned on the ability to show me what would change. So what we have here is like a before and instead of like an after view, because in the after view, nothing changes, right? Because we're in check mode. But what would need to change? So these are the command lines that it needs to send to be in compliance. So here's for NTP across all those routers. And then here's the configs, again, no config, and then what it needs to change for SNMP. So SNMP version 3, it needs to send these configurations. And this is all command line stuff because what happens over the line is the serialized data is in command line form, but how we interact with it is in structured data. So that's why we see structured data here. This is a JSON dictionary, or I can convert using a filter JSON to YAML, but normally this is good enough to look at. This is the logging configurations that need to be sent to create up a logging host and so on. And then further down, we have the access list. So the access list will be applied to tunnel 0, and it has OSPF. So this grants OSPF access. So that's this one here, the control one. So this is the current here is this one that was already in the router for the guest shell. So that was already in these routers, but this is the one that we need to send. That we'll use these particular ones so that we can allow for pings and for OSPF to work on that link. And then ultimately we will apply it to the tunnel 0 interface. So I just scroll down. So all of these things here happen, and then we get to this point. And what this is complaining about is the version is not correct. So I put an older version that's not the one that we want. So this actually failed. So this time, when we look over here, we see a failure, and then we went into staging, and now we're waiting for an approval. But one thing that I want to show you too is that how it looked like it made changes, because when we look in the output here, it does say change for all these, right? So if I click on one, these are the commands. Like it looks like it would have sent those commands, and we have the before. All right, so that's what we were showing on the screen. But if I go to the actual device, and I'll just go to router 1. Let me just click on this. If I do a show run SNMP, there's nothing in there. So it didn't do anything with SNMP. What was some of the other ones? NTP, right? And then we did an access list. So there was that one access list that was already in there, but not the control one. Try it like that. Yeah, so this was already there, this GS.dat ACL. And what else was there? Logging. There is some logging in here, but it doesn't have like the host, the logging host or anything. So we'll see a couple lines of some stuff that was already in the router. Yeah, so it doesn't have like the logging host and some of the other stuff. So where do those configurations come from? So before actually, let this move forward because it takes a second to upgrade. And while it's upgraded, I'll show you how it worked. So if I go back to jobs, we're waiting for an approval. So the way that the approvals work is I'm clicking on these and I can accept it, but it could be a REST API call to this button, if you will, where we can either approve it, deny it. And deny could have like another path to take if we deny it, in our approval, or cancel it like I did earlier where I just wiped out the whole workflow. So these are just buttons, but there's also a REST API to access this. So my ServiceNow or some other ticketing system could be used to interact from approval perspective, or like a change management system could interact too. So I'm going to hit approved, and I get a notice that the approval and the job number. And when we go back to jobs, we can see that now it's moving forward. So here is the actual upgrade stuff, or upgrade task. So right here, what's happening is in this playbook, I'm doing a lot of what we would normally do manually to upgrade the device. And it's interacting with prompts and things like that. And then it gets to the point where it's going to need to reload the OS, because once you tell it what the image is, and the image is there and it's already been TFTP'd, it's got to reboot those routers. Right, so that takes a few minutes. So while that's happening, what I want to do is jump over to here to that GitLab that I mentioned earlier, and I want to show you how some of this stuff is running. So the job templates again map to playbooks. So the first stage, if you will, when we ran those compliance checks, it all really started here. And remember, we defined like the group. So Cisco routers here. So this is just a variable placeholder, right? We told it what devices to point to. And then we're also telling it what roles to run based off of the tag variable. So that's when I did the checkboxes to which compliance do we want to run, which roles. So SNMP and NTP and all that stuff. So it's going to iterate through them. So where they are is in the roles. So if we follow this through, what we want to do is go into roles, right? And we have these different roles. So one of the roles here is like this is NTP, this is the STIG that I mentioned earlier, SNMP, and so on. So we'll just pick on NTP. And if I go into task, this is actually where the playbook contents are, the task, right? So for the iOS routers, this is what we ran here. So we used iOS underscore NTP underscore global module, right? And then this configuration, where does that come from, right? Because we need this configuration is actually, this is a dictionary, and then there's all sorts of parameters that we can define and, to build that NTP configuration. And then also here's where we were looking on the screen where I'm showing the before and also the replace commands that I'm saying is for the remediation. So this is where we're looking at the commands to see what would be sent to the router, or when we run it in run mode, what is actually being sent. So all of that is defined a little bit further back. So if I go back into NTP and look in variables, then this is where we're defining those. So these are key values, right? And sometimes we have list elements because we have more than one. So we iterate it through these two NTP servers. And we're only doing iOS from the Cisco perspective, but I also have iOS XR in here or Nexus OS. And sometimes it's a little bit different. As you can see, there's VRFs and Nexus. So you do have little nuances, and even in the structured data, right? So, and command lines are different as well. So you tend to have to deal with that. So that's the NTP. And the other ones are similar to that. The one that was a little bit different, slightly different, was the show ver. So if we go into the show ver task, iOS, here you can see I have an assertion. So the assertion is a little bit different because I have a failed condition. And that's what happened to us because we did not have the proper image that we set in the survey. So it saw that that was a deviation. So then that's what caused it to fail that stage for the version of the software. So as we were talking, a lot of things were happening in the background. So if I go back into jobs and see where we're at here, we're here at another approval stage. So I'll go ahead and approve this. So what happened was we upgraded, and then we apply the upgrade and waited for it to reboot, and then we did a validation. So let's make sure our validation is good. That's probably the smart thing to do, right? So we saw that it was green. But basically what's happening here is we're checking the version. So now we have the correct version of software running. And we're also checking our OSPF neighbor states. And all these checks have passed. So that was a good validation from that perspective. And I'll come back and show you, I validate two different ways. One with assertions, which is kind of the older way to do it, which is actually my preferred way. And then the other one is using the utils.validate module, which is another method for doing validations. And that's how I accomplished it here, where it does these checks. So it's either pass or fail, and then you would run them against the data that you see from like show commands. So I'm using an integration with the PyATS parser. So PyATS is from Cisco, and that's a good method for Cisco devices to do these types of validations. And they have all the parsers that you need to get the structured data back from the show commands. So having said that, we'll go back to the job that's just sitting, right, waiting for us to approve it. So we validated, everything was good. And then I'll approve it. And now what you'll see is it's going to run that same playbook that we ran earlier, but in run mode. So in run mode, it'll actually make the changes. So see how it says run compliance update? This one is set up in run mode. So if I go to details, job type, playbook run. That's what I was looking at earlier or trying to find, right? So the other one was check. This one's in run mode. So while that runs, actually it already finished. So it's going into the final validation stage. So this validate was written differently. I use assertions just to give you like, what are the two different ways. So this one I used the utils validate, and this one I did assertions. And now everything passed, so I'm doing backups. So right now we're backing up the configs because we're saying this is a good config, right? It's been validated, upgraded. this is like the baseline config. So we're going to go ahead and back these up. And this is just showing deviations in the config from what was in there to what we're backing up now. But once we have these backups in here, now we can use them to check against later for configuration drift. And that's what I mentioned, where that might not be so much compliance, but it's like any of the configs. So does anything change on these devices, then we can detect those. So from a time perspective, let me go ahead and do that, and then I'll walk back through some of these and do a double click into them, like actually what we saw in those. So since we have that intended config backup, what I can do is I can go into a schedule. Well, actually, I'm sorry. Let me do one thing before I start making other changes. So this time we ran that in run mode. So I would expect to see my configuration updated based off of compliance. So if I do show run, S or include, it'll work similar. SNMP, right? Right. So we have these are related to SNMP configuration, and these are like SNMP traps. There's going to be more logging this time with a host, right? So I made those changes. We did NTP. We did the other access list. Right. So now we have this extended control, and then that should be in show run int tunnel 0. Right. So you see it applied to tunnel 0. And then our neighbors work because of the validation, but since we're already here, that access list is allowing the neighbor adjacency through, so we didn't break anything with that. So that's kind of like my local check, right? And we'll go back through the validation. But what I want to do is I want to start this schedule. So this schedule will run and periodically check the router to see if there's any changes. An alternative to a schedule is I could use EDA. And I've done that in other demos where EDA will respond to the router. So the router could use streaming telemetry, and there's an XPath for a config change. So whenever its config changes, it tells EDA, and then EDA will go and look and see what changed. We could do the same thing from a schedule. So that's what we're doing here. So I do have a schedule in here, but this is not going to work the time. So I need to edit it. Right. So we are 10th. And it's actually 3 p.m. right now. Format. Right, so save that. It'll run it 15 times, so that should be enough. Save it. Invalid until you blah, blah, blah. We go back in time. Well, that seemed to work. Turn it on. So it should start up here in a second because I went before that time. So let's watch the jobs, because it should start here. It should kick it off into jobs. Just make sure run 810. I don't know if maybe I went too far back. Let's see if it's doing anything here. Yeah, 1 minute. Yeah, I don't. Maybe that's not going to work like that. Let me try the 3 p.m. again. Another thing I can do is I can manually kick it off too, but usually the schedules work okay like that. If I do it a little bit behind, it'll kick it off like the next minute or so. Maybe let's do that. All right, so hopefully this pops up here if I leave it alone. And if it doesn't, I'll just manually kick it off. But what I want to show you is the drift. So we're in router 1. Int LO0. Oops. All right, so I'm just going to change the description. Um, just so you know that this is something that I'm adding right now. If anyone wants to unmute and just give me something to put in as a description, so it's completely unique. Or you can put it in the chat or something. Just anything. Okay. Thank you very much. All right, so I pop back over to here. So that's a description. All right, then see what's going on here. Did it ever kick off the job? No, it didn't. So I'm just going to go ahead and do this manually, and I'll figure out why my schedule. It might be because I need to be admin, so I didn't think about that too. I might not have give enough privileges for this to work. But I'm going to go ahead and go to the intended config drift here and run it. So the scheduler should have like did that for me and then run it every minute. And you can see it's showing me what changed. So basically it's configured to compare a diff between the running config, or you can change it to startup config, and it compares it against that intended configuration. So the before is actually what it found on the device, and then it compares it, like the after is what it sees in that configuration file. So here, what I did is I made a failed condition if the diff check has a configuration drift, so it will send a notification. So you probably saw that pop up briefly. So it'll send a notification to Slack, so that way someone can be notified that there was a change. Or I could create like a list of what changed, and just have that. So it's a list of things that I either want to keep or have a downtime to go and then override that change. So config drift is usually like to identify and see what changed. And then normally you wouldn't automate it, the remediation, depending on what the config is, you'd want someone to look at that. So once it's like, identified as a change, then you would go through the proper process of pushing it back in. So that was the last part of it. Real quick, some of the things that we didn't look at, and then I'll cut this recording off, is back here in the workflow. We got to this point here when we did the approval, and then we ran it again, and you'll notice it looks just like the first time with changed. And you can see it was an empty dictionary, like the config didn't exist, and then here's what would replace. But this time it actually did replace. So these change were actually changed because it was in run mode. And then once we made the change, we looked at it locally on the router. But what it did from a validation perspective was to do this, validate here. That's weird too. I didn't get, that might be my browser or something. Why is it not showing me all the, let me go back out. The failed here is because our drift failed. So I baked that into there as part of the notification too. Oh, here's something I could try too. Not the squirrel, but let me go in as admin. Kind of perplexed that my schedule didn't kick off the way that it should. I have to probably look at that role. So here's the schedules. Now I have other stuff here. It's this one. No exceptions, run every minute. Change this to, no, I'll keep it that just to see what happens. Let that bake for a second. So the validations that we wanted to see. So let me go back to there. Jobs. So validate. No host matched. So what did we have in here? So compliance roles. I think that validate is back here. I might have messed that up while I was playing with these. Oh, it had the group key. Yeah, it didn't pick up on that. So I could run that again. Actually, I could change it from here real quick. Just so you can see the output. So here it was looking for that variable. I don't know why that didn't pass through. So what was it? Cisco only. Just put it in here. And to save it here, you do that. Commit it. Continue. So that should actually change it. And then if you want to rerun a job, so this is a good example of that. So if something happens, like if there's a mistake or something like this, you can rerun it again. Yes, see that time it picked up on the host from that group because I changed it. And you can see here are the health checks for the OSPF neighbors. OSPF neighbor is full, right? So everything passed. So this was actually an assertion, which is a little bit different than the first one. So the last thing to show you would be how those look. So if I go into validate, this is the validate that we were just looking at. You can see that here I'm doing just a basic show command. So it's just iOS underscore command, show IP OSPF neighbor, and then I'm registering the output. And what I'm looking for here in this registered output, so this is what the output of the show command goes into memory, and then I have access to it. So OSPF. So inside of OSPF, I can look at the standard output in this case, because this is like unstructured data here. And what I'm doing is I want to match on something in particular. So what I want to see is that it's full. So that neighbor adjacency for OSPF should be a full neighbor. And if it's some other condition, then it would fail, right? So it succeeds if it's full. If it's anything other than full, it's false, so it would fail. And if it's unable to pass the first time, it'll retry 3 times and wait 10 seconds because sometimes it takes a bit longer for like a routing protocol to converge. OSPF is usually pretty quick, but like especially BGP, you want to give it a little bit extra time if you're looking at that so it can reconverge. So that's why we have this parameter for retries and delay. So that way we could fail a couple of times, but not fail the playbook and just keep retrying until we pass. So that's what was in the assertion. The other one was different. So that one was the first health check was a roll. And it's actually not going to be in this one. So that particular one, if I go back to projects and I look at the compliance routers, compliance upgrade ACL, router upgrades. So this one is this link here. So you can always like map yourself back to where this content is. So I want to go to this link here. And I have this notion of criteria. So this is just JSON, and it points to where you start looking at an object at a particular place in the structured data, and then we're looking for the type could be string or boolean or whatever it actually is in that structured data, and then the pattern that we're looking for. So there, where I was looking at unstructured data, I was looking for full. Now I'm looking for it as a key, or the value of a key should be full. So the key is actually state, and the value is full. So the pattern is actually the same thing as a value. So it's looking for that in the output, and then how it's used. So that's the criteria that we map to it. If I go into this validate here, you can see that we do the show IPOSPF neighbor, but we're using PyATS because this is a parser, so we have structured data. And then in the structured data, we're pointing to this particular point here, and then it's looking in the criteria, which was full, right? So it looks over for that criteria file, and we're looking for full, and then we would see the result, and then we would register the result, and then we would show on the screen whether it passes or fails. So that's what that validate looked like. So that validate was the first one, which let me go back to jobs. I'm starting to get lost in all these clicks, right? So go back to here. That validate was upgrade downtime, upgrade apply. This validate. Right, so here's where we see that we have the proper image, and that all checks passed. And the checks themselves was the full condition of the neighbor adjacency. So if you click into these, you'll get more data in that. So that just shows all checks passed. But if I go back to neighbor state parse, validate the OSPF state, all checks. Well, actually, it doesn't. I would have to debug it on the screen to actually show that. But that's what you're seeing is from that that utils validate module. And what I mean by that is this one over here. So when we get to here, it's this. So if you're doing any type of validation, this is how you can do it with structured data. And if you want to use unstructured data, then use the assertion. So they're kind of the same thing, just a different approach. But you can, at the end of the day, you point to pass-fail conditions. And you want to do that in any of your workflows, so that way you can validate every change that you're making. And that's a good best practice. So that was a lot of stuff. Sorry, my scheduling thing didn't work, so I'll have to go and see what I messed up there. It was working last night when I first created it. Kind of bugs me that it never kicked off. Let me do this. Just one last thing. I promise. So we go into this sucker here. I'm just gonna get rid of it. So when you go into the templates, so this one is on the second page. Configuration drift. And this is how you set these up, just for your reference, right? So you have schedules, right? So I have this schedule here, which goes back to that. So I want to go to this, schedules. I'm going to get rid of that sucker. I don't know what I did, but it's not good. Add, minute. Go ahead and make it go back in time so it just kicks off the big drift. Blah, 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 blah. Save. It's definitely on. It's definitely the 10th. All right. Maybe going back in time just doesn't work anymore, but that's what I used to do. So I wouldn't have to wait too long. Has it been a minute? All right. Well, we'll come back. We'll do more scheduling later. I'm not sure. That really does bother me though, but we'll come back to that one. We'll circle back. It's definitely something that I'm doing wrong that I'm just not seeing right in front of my face. It's on local time. And so with that, I'm going to go ahead and pause for any questions. And I'm going to shut this recording off. And anyone that wants to stay on, I'm going to do some Jinja 2 templates for the study guide, the hands-on lab part of it, here in a second. Just one last hopeful thing that it popped up. I'm going to run it in the background, even though I have to wait 10 minutes. And if for some reason it works, I'll let you guys know. It's definitely on. All right. So yeah, I don't know what's going on with that one, but let's go and shut off the recording. Stop recording.